Wilken is the William R. Kenan Jr. Professor of History of Christianity Emeritus at the University of Virginia. And just this past year, he held the chair, the Reverend Robert J. Randall Professor Chair in Christian Culture at Providence College. He is very much of this place, having come to study for a doctorate at the University of Chicago in 1960. And if imitation is a form of flattery, then it should also be mentioned that he's recognized not also for his many visits to Lumen Christi and to the University of Chicago, but also for founding at his own institution from which he retired, the University of Virginia, the St. Anselm Institute, which is, I think, a great institute that carries forward much of the spirit of Lumen Christi and is a great sign of the national impact of what has started here with the help of people like Robert Louis Wilken at the University of Chicago and at Lumen Christi. Robert Wilken has taught at Notre Dame, Fordham, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Institutum Patristicum Augustinianum, Gregorian University, and as I mentioned, Providence College. He's former president of the American Academy of Religion and a founding member and president of the North American Patristic Society. Many of you are very familiar with his great and groundbreaking publications on early Christianity, on patristics, 1984 with Yale Press, Christians as the Romans Saw Them, Remembering the Christian Past, 1995. His great love for Maximus the Confessor resulted in the 2003 book on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ, Selected Writings of St. Maximus the Confessor. A gem that has particularly fascinated and inspired me, the spirit of early Christian thought, and then part of a very important series with Erdmann's Press, his volume, very intriguing and meditative and scholarly volume, Isaiah, interpreted by the early Christian and medieval commentators. It's also a pleasure, since he was a fellow at the institute I run at DePaul, to mention that in November of this year, his magnum opus will be appearing with Yale University Press, an intriguing book that brings together his great wealth of knowledge and wisdom regarding the early church, together with a kind of new perspective on the global dimension of Christianity. The book will be entitled The First 1,000 Years, A Global History of Christianity. So it's a great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, who will speak on the Catholic roots of religious freedom. Please join me in welcoming Robert Louis Wilken.
Thank you very much, Peter. It does bring back many memories. I arrived here in June of 1960 with a new bride, took up residence in the Divinity School dwelling, which was over at 5482 Greenwood, right across the street from the Lutheran Seminary. And I got here early that summer because those of you who know the history of the Divinity School realized there was a barrage of exams that you had to pass before you could actually begin your studies. And I spent the summer then reading in all kind of areas I had never thought very much about. And I don't know whether I had a class in this room, but I think history was over this way, and I did take some classes in the history department, and classics was over where the old library used to be. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I also want to reinforce what Peter said. I gave a lecture, I think maybe 12 years ago with Lumen Christi, and I was so impressed at what Paul Griffiths and Tom Levergood were doing here, that as soon as I got back to Virginia, I got together a group of faculty, and we started meeting in my home, and 4 months later we had decided to form the St. Anselm Institute, which is basically modeled, but we're not as high-flying as Thomas Levergood is, and it's a much more modest undertaking, but it has very much the same kind of mission to make Catholic intellectual life a vital part of a modern American university. But tonight I'm speaking about something quite different. I'm going to kind of take you back to I think a little known past of Christianity, but to kind of set the context, I'm going to sort of start with the present. So even before the outburst following the administration's decision to reaffirm the mandate of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services requiring all religious institutions, except for houses of worship, to cover reproductive services, including contraception, drugs that cause abortion, and sterilization, religious leaders were concerned about growing challenges to religious freedom. In October of last year, Bishop Laurie of Bridgeport, he is being installed, is that the proper word, Bernie? Installed as the new bishop. I still don't get the Catholic lingo always correct. I was received in 1994 when I was a student here. I was a Lutheran, I just finished from Lutheran Seminary. He's being installed today, and since I'm going to mention the evangelicals and Catholics on religious freedom in just a minute here, the memorial service for Chuck Colson is being held at the National Cathedral today. And there are two events that I really should be at, but Thomas got to me earlier. But Bishop Laurie appeared before the Judiciary Committee of the United States House of Representatives, the committee dealing with the Constitution. And the occasion of his visit was proposed legislation before the House, and Bishop Laurie took the appearance before the committee to identify certain threats to religious liberty that have emerged with particular urgency in America today. He said that in the recent past, the bishops of the United States have watched with increasing alarm as the great national legacy of religious liberty has been subject to ever more frequent assault and ever more rapid erosion. In his testimony, he reported that last June, the Catholic bishops, that's last June, a year ago, in the United States had established an ad hoc committee for religious liberty to resist these assaults and reverse this erosion. The decision to set up the committee and to appoint him chairman, he said, an action at near light speed in the church's time, attests to the urgency of the matter. Though the decision was based on facts, it's his word, arising before June of 2011, Bishop Laurie wished to call attention to threats to religious liberty that have emerged even since June. And these are some of the cases that he mentioned last October. The HHS mandate on reproductive services, a new requirement that makes it difficult for the United States, the Conference of Catholic Bishops, Migration and Refugee Services to carry on their work because it does not provide the full range of reproductive services. The State Department Agency for International Development requires contractors such as Catholic Relief Services to provide comprehensive HIV prevention activities, including condom distribution, as well as reproductive services. And then it's also the challenge to the Defense of Marriage Act. And one could also mention such things that in 2006, Catholic Charities of Boston closed down its adoption work rather than comply with state law requiring that gays be allowed to adopt children. And then a year or so later, Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Washington shut down its foster care and public adoption program because of a new law in the District of Columbia, where I live, recognizing same-sex marriages. There have been others who have been addressing this issue. In First Things, in March, there was a statement on religious freedom by evangelicals and Catholics together, which I was a part of. Back in January, a group of religious leaders, including Archbishop Dolan, had published an open letter on marriage and religious freedom. And in March, the Administrative Committee of the USCCB issued a statement, United for Religious Freedom. Now, the news on religious freedom does not all run in one direction. In January, in a historic decision, the United States Supreme Court recognized a ministerial exception to employment discrimination laws. Churches and other religious groups must be free to choose and dismiss their leaders without government influence. All nine justices supported the decision. And Chief Justice Roberts wrote that the free exercise and establishment clauses of the Constitution bar the government from interfering with the internal governance of churches. A church, he wrote, has the right to shape its own faith and mission through its appointment. This was Tabor Hosanna, a church in the Detroit area. The Supreme Court decision was very good news, in fact, startling news. But it was accompanied by a troubling side. The suit against the church in Michigan was brought by the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission of the U.S. government, and its lawyers argued that the legal issue would be essentially the same whether the woman had been employed by a church, a labor union, a social club, or any other group with rights of free association under the First Amendment. That is, churches and religious groups would not be treated differently from other associations or clubs, including labor unions. We see it as a question of freedom of association, said the Justice Department attorney, Ms. Kruger, before the court. It did not raise questions about the free exercise of religion in the mind of the government lawyers. Now, I mention these recent challenges to religious liberty and the decision of the Supreme Court to highlight how pressing these matters have become in recent years. It is, however, not my aim to address the current debates directly. I cite them only to provide a context for my talk. I'm a historian whose scholarship and writings have been focused on the early centuries of Christian history. I once said to my dear friend, the late Father Richard John Newhouse, the founder of the monthly First Things, that one of my roles as a Christian scholar was to provide footnotes for those who are engaged in fighting the cultural wars of our times. Newhouse got up each morning, he put on his breastplate, mounted his steed, and set out with words to slay whatever dragons were prowling the earth that particular day. Then sometimes he'd call me in the morning, and he'd want an apt quotation from one of the church fathers for something he was writing. So I spent most of my life reading old books and writing about debates that animated societies in ancient times. So I thought one way I could contribute to the current discussion is to provide a few footnotes to the understanding of religious freedom as it emerged in Western civilization. In particular, I want to draw attention to several early Christian writers whose thinking helps us understand the deep background of later ideas on religious freedom. Catholics not only have a stake in the current legal battles, they have something to contribute to the understanding of religious freedom. Now, as you know, the Declaration on Religious Freedom at Vatican Council, Dignitatis Humanae, was adopted by the Council Fathers only after a long struggle. To some bishops, a significant minority, the proposed document seemed a departure from Catholic teaching, affirmed by popes in the 19th century in the encyclicals Mirare Vos of Gregory XVI in 1832 and Quanta Cura of Pius IX in 1864. I cite only one passage from Quanta Cura in which Pius IX cites Mirare Vos. Pope Gregory there says that it was insane to think that liberty of conscience and worship is each man's personal right, which ought to be legally proclaimed and asserted in every rightly constituted society, and that a right resides in the citizens to an absolute liberty which should be restrained by no authority, whether ecclesiastical or civil, whether they may be able openly and publicly to manifest and declare any of their ideas, whatever, either by word of mouth or by the press or in any other way. Set alongside these papal statements, the central affirmation of Dignitatis Humanae seems startling. This Vatican Synod declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. Such freedom consists in this, that all should have such immunity from coercion by individuals or by groups or by any human power, that no one should be forced to act according to his conscience in religious matters, nor prevented from acting according to his conscience, whether in private or in public, whether alone or in association with others. There's a whole long debate about how you bring these things into relation with one another. It must be remembered that Dignitatis Humanae deals with religious liberty in relation to constitutional limits on the power of governments. And in that way, it does try to establish a continuity, but it moves in a different direction from 19th century statements. No merely human power can either command or prohibit religious acts, and the government ought to take account of the religious life of the people and show it favor. So there's a debate there. I just wanted to alert you to that debate. That's not what I'm going to go into. I'm interested more in the second part of the Declaration, which addresses the question of the freedom of the act of faith. There, the Council Fathers set forth the theological sources from which their teaching is drawn: the Holy Scriptures, the writings of the Church Fathers, and medieval thinkers. In that section, they establish continuity between what they teach and very early Christian tradition. The first writer